Hello everyone and welcome to another ModellingSeb video. I know this video is a little delayed. It was supposed to release last week but I had to go to hospital, which also means if my voice sounds a bit different right now, that's because I'm recording this part right after getting out of hospital. Now with that aside, so let's go and finally finish this model that has been 10 months in the waiting. To begin, I take off the tracks, wheels and the turret in order to have easier access to the lower hull. This is because the first step is to add some mud texture. For this I'll be using a mud paste from MIG Ammo. This is a big tub of an acrylic texture paste which is supposed to be used primarily for dioramas. However, it is also effectively used on models. The only problem is that since this was meant for dioramas, it dries a lot more quickly compared to other specific pastes meant for models. This just means you have to work in smaller sections at a time and more quickly. Another downside of this diorama paste is that it has some pretty large chunks used for texturing. This isn't very visible in dioramas, but becomes very apparent when you use it on a model. My advice here would be to simply pick these out either with a pair of tweezers or to move them off with a slightly dampened brush. After applying the paste, I blend it in using a wet brush. This product does leave behind a clear acrylic film which tends to silver after it dries, which means it's very important to remove as much as you can. Whilst removing this clear film, I make sure to form the paste into a shape and into the places where I want the mud to be. I am being quite heavy-handed here since the model is supposed to be set in Estonia in autumn, and models that are placed in autumn usually are quite muddy. Plus, I don't really build in a realistic style, which should be obvious by now, so consider this more of an artistic interpretation rather than a realistic one. The other problem with the T-34 is that the majority of the mud will be covered up by the wheels. This means that you have to use the wheels to show how the mud behind it would look. And speaking of the wheels, they will get the same treatment of texture paste. The rule here is to have more on the outside of the wheel in the crevices as compared to the central part around the wheel hub. The full 1940 style wheels are much easier to do since they allow me to use a larger and wider brush compared to the spider wheels. I don't want to fill in the small holes in the spider pattern, which means I have to use a much smaller brush. This means that creating mud deposits takes up more than double the time of the standard wheel. With the texture added, it is now time to get a unified base coat applied. This means I have to pre-dust the areas that will receive the enamel mud product. For the pre-dust, I use the same ultimate pre-dust mix I made for the Whipper a year ago. I do however add a small amount of shadow tone from the post shading. This will unify the colour of the mud with the colour of the lower hull slightly more. Pre-dusting isn't supposed to cover the entirety of the lower hull, only the places where the mud effects will go. This effectively works as a base layer for all the effects that will be added on later. Using the pre-dust, I cover all of the textured mud. This makes sure none of the original colour is showing through. I also pre-dust the areas around the mud in order to blend the clean and muddy surfaces. The first enamel effect that will be used is Dry Earth from the Ammo Splashes range. This is the foundation for all the upcoming effects. This working with the overall coverage of the pre-shade makes it much easier to blend all of the effects together to form a single complete work. The Dry Earth is applied liberally and blended in streaking motions using White Spirit. I make sure to create some heavy and more visible streaks that will end up being seen after all the effects are applied. Over the top of this, I choose to wet blend a mix of earth and dark mud oil paint from Ammo with engine grime enamel effects. I must say, if I was to do this again, I would use a slightly different mix. This one is a bit more appropriate for something like Kursk, but that just means I have to mix in a little bit more engine grime over the top. Wet blending means that the first layer is not allowed to dry. So when I apply the engine grime over the top of the oil paints, they are still wet. This makes the blending process easier as the two paints mix in a random and ununiform pattern rather than how they would mix if they were blended otherwise. Now, I know engine grime is not the first effect you would think of when making mud, however I must say it does work very well. Because engine grime has a very muted colour as well as it being a sort of greenish grey with some brown mixed in, it effectively works as a dark wash. Engine grime is also a fantastic colour to use for when you want to have a base layer for wet mud, which will be applied later on. Now, I just want to quickly say, if you are enjoying this video, do consider subscribing and check out my socials in the description of this video. There is a link there to a Discord server that is filled with great modelers, and we are currently hosting 2 group builds. If this does sound like something that might interest you, please do go check it out. Now, back to it. The wheels also receive the same effects, however I do make sure that they aren't completely drowned in them. This is done in order to have some of the original colour from underneath still show through. I also choose not to add all of these effects onto the wheel hubs. This is done on purpose and you will see why later. The dry effects that I applied on the wheels are specifically thinned down, since blending it in would be a lot harder. Usually when you blend something, it goes in accordance to gravity, meaning top to bottom. However, since the wheels are spinning, that is not the same. This means that the effect should be more towards the outside than the inside of the wheel. Now, to offset the heavy use of engine grime for the mud, I speckle some loose ground also from the Ammo Splashes range. This simply adds some more colour to the centre of the lower hull because it is a bit too clean. Ammo Splashes are textured, which means that these speckles do have some volume, so they won't be completely 2D. After this, I use a dark brown oil paint, also from the Ammo Oil Brushes line. I use this to add some dark streaks of mud. These are going to effectively show that the wet mud has fallen and left behind a streak. This also creates colour contrast, which is important in areas of little visibility. If the streaks were too similar to each other, then that could mean that they would be barely visible from the outside, which is also why there are several different colours being used for the mud in general. These streaks are blended in using a small brush and white spirit, creating these very thin streaks of mud. The final step to wrap out the weathering of the lower hull is to add some wet mud, which is the whole point of this muddy mess. For this, I create my own mix of damp earth, black panel liner, and wet effects. The damp earth and black wash are mixed evenly, with about 30% of the total mix being wet effect. This is only slightly thinned in order to not dilute the effect too much so that the mud appears less glossy. This is only applied in the areas with the most mud texture to keep it consistent. After this is applied, I then also speckle some of it onto the whole lower hull. But I do make sure to make this a very small amount, which ended up being barely visible in the end. And now to finish the wheels too, remember how I said I didn't cover the hubcaps on purpose? Well, if you forgot, I did say that, but I did this in order to now apply a thin layer of fuel stains and oil stains. This is a pretty nice little detail in my opinion, and it adds some clear signs that the tank receives maintenance from its crew. With the main bit of weathering out of the way, it is now time to make sure the rest of the model is fully finished. The heavy use of oil modulation and enamel effects for the rust have meant that these white markings got quite discoloured. In order to bring back a bit of life into them, I chose to add a small amount of white oil paint to the centre of each of the numbers. This will also let me create some gentle streaking marks showing some paint runoff. Of course, this is not as heavy as it would be on a Berlin T-34, but even small streaks like this add a bit more visual interest to the model. Since the fenders are fully intact besides from the front, no serious amount of mud is going to be kicked up. But I did still do a little speckling in order to have the fenders have some more dirt on them. But the most interesting detail on the T-34 and all Soviet and even modern Russian tanks is how dirty they got from oil and fuel stains. So to add some of this, I add engine grime around these openings. Originally I thought these were some sort of vents for cooling, but turns out these are part of the engine decks that are meant to be removable, and under them are the fuel tanks. Using engine grime, I make a pretty heavy line under these openings, which I then streak downwards since the armour is sloped. However, engine grime is not exactly colourful and all that visible, so I then repeat this with a very small amount of fuel stains, making this part of the model more in line with the rest. Some details still need to be painted, and the most obvious one is the headlamp. This received a couple coats of Vallejo silver in order to have them fully even and level. After they dry, I take enamel wet effect. This creates the illusion of glass. I do also do this on the brake lights, but I forgot to film that. The last things to add on the tank itself is the soot for the exhaust. Originally I used some black pigment, which is the only time I would use pigment. This was my go-to strategy, but for some reason after applying it, it fell off. This is when I looked at the T-34 122 by Adam Wilder, and he used the massive soot effects. He created them by simply airbrushing some black, so I do the same to create these heavy soot lines. I do make sure my air pressure is quite low because I don't want it going all over the place. With the tank out of the way, the only things remain are the tracks. I didn't really want to overcomplicate them, so I solely relied on speckling, although at the end I did brush some wet effects in certain spots. The first set of speckling is done using dry step. This is also a good time to mention that when you speckle, you don't want your brush to be completely filled with the enamel effect, you only want a small amount. This is why I removed the majority on a piece of kitchen roll under the tracks. This also saves my cutting mat from being covered in every single weathering effect I use. The second tone is loose ground, to bring in a mid-tone between this significantly lighter dry step and the final tone. And this final tone is the same wet mud effect I mixed earlier. This effect is also then applied in some of the deeper crevices. With these effects applied, I use a coarse sanding sponge to clean off the contact points. This is the major benefit of metal tracks, but with this done, that means the model is now complete. Now I must say thank you so much for watching, not just this video, but this whole series. It has been by far the most viewed one on my channel, and I know a lot of you have probably come from the previous videos. If you got this far, I would like to ask you again to consider subscribing and checking out the socials in the description if you want to. I know this video was a bit delayed, but that will definitely not be a problem with the next video since that one is already filmed and ready to be released. To give you a little glimpse of the next project, it will be another shelf queen that I started around the same time as the T-34, which is also why this one took so long since I don't focus on a single project at once. But again, I must thank you all for your time. It really does mean a lot that people decide to spend their time watching my videos. I hope you all have fun building more models, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.